You ever stop to think about how just one single word can completely change the way you see a person? How it can, build a wall or a bridge in a split second? Well, today, we're diving deep into that powerful connection between our words and the stigma they create.
So just look at these three words: hooker, prostitute, sex worker. Do they all paint the exact same picture in your head? Do they feel the same? I'm going to go out on a limb and say, probably not. And that difference, that feeling, is exactly what we're going to unpack.
And this isn't just some hypothetical philosophical question. We've actually got new research hot off the press from the Journal of Sex Research that gives us cold, hard data on how the words we pick can either reinforce prejudice or start to break it down.
And let's be super clear here. This goes way beyond just being polite or, politically correct. We're talking about how our vocabulary has this profound, often totally unconscious effect on how we judge people. A single word can literally sculpt our entire viewpoint without us even noticing.
So you might be wondering, who decides to systematically investigate something like this, and why? Well, let's get into it, because it turns out personal experience is what really fueled this whole thing.
Meet Sarah Lindley. She's the lead researcher on this study. And for her, this wasn't just some abstract academic project. No, her motivation came from years of being on the front lines, volunteering and seeing the real-world human impact of stigma firsthand. And that personal connection is really what gives this research its power.
And let's not mince words about what's at stake. This is not a small issue. The social prejudice people in this industry face is so intense that it can actually normalize things like violence and discrimination. The consequences are incredibly dangerous and very, very real.
So this all leads to the one central question these researchers wanted to answer. It's a simple idea, but a really powerful one. Could something as basic as changing our vocabulary actually be a meaningful step toward reducing real-world harm?
Now, trying to measure something as tricky as unconscious bias is, well, it's tough. You have to be so careful not to accidentally influence the very thing you're trying to observe. So how on earth did they do it?
Okay, so a huge problem with a lot of past studies was this little psychological trap called anchoring bias. Let's say I ask you to rate the word hooker, and then right after I ask you to rate sex worker. Your negative feelings about that first word are almost guaranteed to bleed over and taint how you see the second one. That first answer anchors your next one.
So, to get around this, the researchers came up with a much smarter method. They brought in almost 400 people, but, and this is the absolute key, each person was only shown one of the terms to think about, just one. By doing this, they completely avoided that whole anchoring problem, and it gave them a much cleaner, more accurate picture of people's true, gut-level feelings about each word.
And these were the 4 specific words they put under the microscope. You've got sex worker and escort, which are often seen as more neutral or professional. And then you have prostitute and hooker, 2 words that carry, a lot of negative historical weight.
All right, so they ran the experiment with this really clever design. What did they actually find out? Well, the results were pretty fascinating and showed a huge contrast in how people see these groups.
I mean, the difference was like night and day, seriously. The people who saw sex worker or escort associated those terms with things like economic success and having agency. But the folks who saw prostitute or hooker, they used a totally different set of words: poorly educated, ugly, and victims. The word itself completely changed the story people told.
But, and this is a really important but, even with those more positive terms, a really powerful underlying stigma was still there. Across all 4 groups, without exception, the 2 most common adjectives people used were promiscuous and sexually perverse. This shows that while some words are definitely better than others, there's a deep-seated sexual stigma that just sticks around no matter what you call it.
The study also dove into how people perceive race in the industry. And what they found was that participants guessed that there was a much higher proportion of Black individuals in sex work than there actually is in the general U.S. population. That kind of overestimation really suggests that media portrayals might be skewing how we see things.
And this is where the findings get even more complex and, frankly, pretty disturbing. The researchers didn't just find a bias against certain words. They found this really powerful and troubling connection between that language and racial bias.
Okay, let's break this down because it's a huge deal. The researcher discovered that the more a person believed that the group they called hookers was made up of Black individuals, the more negatively they viewed that group.
So think about what that means. It suggests that racial bias is actively pouring fuel on the fire, making the most dehumanizing language even more potent. So, okay, we've got all this data, but why does it actually matter outside of a scientific journal? What's the real-world impact of all this?
The impact is, well, it's everywhere. Think about the media we consume. It can either build people up or tear them down. Think about the legal system, where one word a lawyer uses could potentially sway an entire jury. This kind of language contributes to a climate where violence is seen as more acceptable, and that's exactly why the researchers are now taking these ideas into mock jury trials.
At the end of the day, this is the big takeaway, and the lead researcher sums it up perfectly. This isn't just some interesting thought experiment. It has real consequences for real people, and it's another powerful reminder that we really need to be intentional and thoughtful with every single word we choose. So that leaves all of us with one final question to think about. We've just seen pretty clear proof that a single word can dramatically change how we perceive an entire group of people. So the question is, what other words are we all using, maybe without even thinking about it, that are doing the exact same thing?